So thank you once again for being here. I just want to take the opportunity to extend my condolences and sympathies to the families of those who've suffered losses in Sweden in relation to the COVID virus. And also to say that South Africa shares in your losses as we and many other countries around the world experience similar losses. So we're talking to the ambassador today, who is the ambassador of Sweden to South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, and Namibia since September 2016. Ambassador Julin entered the Swedish diplomatic service in 1984, serving as ambassador in Spain and Andorra and Slovakia, with postings in Peru, Israel, and the United States of America. She's also worked in departments for trade relations and policy and has been chief of staff to the Minister for European Union Affairs and Trade, and also served as head of department for press and communications for the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Stockholm. Ambassador Julin has also served in committees for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, something many of our students who've learned about international organizations should be aware of and know of, and has sat in negotiations on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Ambassador Julin completed a Master's in Economics through the University of Stockholm, and we'd just like to open up the floor now, and thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time to talk to us about feminist foreign policy and other matters. Thank you.
A big thank you to the University of Johannesburg and the University of Johannesburg's library for giving us this platform to talk a little bit about our favorite subject, which is feminist foreign policy. And thank you everyone who's attending by your computers through Facebook or the university webpage or the embassy's Facebook page. I wish you very welcome, and I'm very glad to wanted to dedicate some of your time to this dialogue. I wanted just to start with maybe giving a short background on sort of Swedish-South African relation, which I think can help as a base for what we're going to talk about later. And you can say Swedish-South African relations go back fairly back in time, although Sweden has no colonial history here. But from the early 1960s, Sweden became quite engaged in the situation in South Africa and in the struggle against apartheid. And I think one very strongly contributing factor was a young South African student, Billy Modise, who came to Sweden, to Lund in the south of Sweden on a scholarship to study at the university there. And of course, he immediately also set about informing people around him about the situation in South Africa. And he went as far as when the then Prime Minister of Sweden, Tage Erlander, came to the University of Lund, which was his alma mater. After his lecture, Billy Modise went up to him and started talking about the situation in South Africa. And in the end, he said, well, Mr. Prime Minister, I would like for Sweden to institute sanctions against South Africa and boycott South African goods. And the Prime Minister said, well, you know, I certainly share your concern about the situation in your country, but Swedish law does not permit me to institute sanctions against a country with which we are not at war. And as much as I dislike the situation and the policies in South Africa, we're not at war with the country. But young man, please go ahead and lobby for this position among my countrymen. And Billy Modise set about doing that. He biked around, he hitchhiked around in Sweden and talked to organizations and meetings all over the place. And the Swedes got engaged throughout the 60s. More and more people got engaged. Churches, schools, sports clubs, consumer organizations, the unions, NGOs, and of course the political parties and parliament. And the support from Sweden became quite massive, I have to say. For around 30 years, Sweden contributed to more than half of the ANC's civilian budget. We did the same thing for the UDF when that was established. And then we also supported a lot of scholarships and a lot of support that went inside South Africa in those days to help families of exiles or political prisoners, or helping with legal defense where that was needed. Then I think was another contributing factor to the strong sort of links was the friendship that was struck up between our now late Prime Minister Olof Palme and Oliver Tambo. they really saw eye to eye, and Oliver Tambo would come to Sweden regularly to discuss the support, and Olof Palme would invite him to his townhouse, where he would cook the Swedish falukorv, which is our version of a boerwurst, you can say, and they would sit at the kitchen table and discuss issues of the world on a very personal basis. And then I think Sweden was rewarded a bit for this strong engagement when Nelson Mandela decided to visit Sweden on his first trip outside Africa. And he came to Stockholm in March 1990. Officially, it was to say thank you to Sweden for the strong support. But I think primarily it was to visit and for the first time, again, meet with his good friend Oliver Tambo, who was then receiving rehabilitation care in Stockholm after his stroke. But we were very proud to have Nelson Mandela in Stockholm in those days. And then, of course, after democratization, we continued with official development cooperation. And since 2000, we have a binational commission between Sweden and South Africa. And as the only Western country, we have it at the deputy president level. And this year, we were supposed to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the BNC. And our Prime Minister and President Ramaphosa had then decided to upgrade it temporarily. So our Prime Minister would come here for the BNC, where we would discuss economic, political, cultural, scientific cooperation. And we were all set to go beginning of March, but then Corona came in between. So we'll have to see. And just one last point. We're very proud to say that Sweden has the first ever permanent exhibition at Lillesleaf Farm Museum. There's a permanent exhibition on Sweden's role in the struggle against apartheid. And we were the first country to be invited to have such an exhibition there. So if you have a day free, I would recommend you to go to Lillesleaf. But then, why does Sweden have a feminist government? Well, I think the short answer is it's the right thing to do. But we had a change of government in 2014. And since then, we have a coalition government between the Social Democrats and the Green Party. And they declared themselves the first feminist government in the world. They have later been followed by Canada, by Mexico, and by Spain. But we were the first to institute it. And I think the basic reason was that we all realized that gender equality, it is a matter of human rights, of democracy and justice. We also think it's driving social development and creating change in people's lives. And it also brings, it makes perfect economic sense and brings growth. If you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, that shows a very strong correlation between a country's gender gap and its economic performance. But also in general, as our former Foreign Minister Margot Wallström used to say, we just cannot leave half of the team out of the game. That's the short. But you can say that Sweden was maybe well ahead in gender equality when in 2014 we declared ourselves a feminist government. But it hasn't come by itself. It's been a long struggle and a lot of conscious decisions and hard work by a very strong civil society to come where we are. It was only in 1921 that the Swedish women got the right to vote in parliamentary elections. In 1921, the women in Sweden got the vote. And we were then the last of the Nordic countries to give women the vote. Another step was in 1971 when we instituted separate income taxation, which was an incentive for women to work and not being just seen as a part of the husband's income. And it actually gave an incentive for women to join the labor force. And then all through the 1970s, we built up a good public and affordable childcare system, which was a prerequisite for women to be able to join the labor market. We, in 1974, instituted gender-neutral paid parental leave, which today is 16 months, and 3 of these months must be taken by either parent. So it really gives an incentive for fathers to join and use the opportunities to care for their children as well. I think it's been a strong political will on behalf of everyone to shape a fair and gender equal society. We have worked hard since the 1990s with gender mainstreaming, where every minister has had the responsibility in his or her department to see that all proposals, laws or regulations that are proposed have looked at it from a gender equality perspective, that's incorporated. And that's every minister's responsibility to do. We have a minister for equality that then sees that all this is coordinated and implemented in a good way. We have had gender responsive budgeting for a long time, where you have to look at all your budget proposals from a gender equality perspective as well, and you have to look at consequences for both genders. And you have also to ensure that some of your decisions are made on statistics that have been disaggregated by gender, because that can be very important. And then I think we have been very careful to have, this is not a woman's issue, it's everyone's issue. So to have the men participating in all this, I think has been crucial for its success. But primarily, I think, but it's been, we've had a political consensus about this, irrespective if we've had a center-left government or a center-right government. There's been a consensus that we should continue in the direction of a fair and gender equal society. So we share the same goal. So women in politics in Sweden, the balance is fairly equal. And that's because since the 70s, political parties decided that they would have, I think what's called here zebra lists. Every second name has to be a man and a woman. And basically every party in Sweden has now followed that. It's no law, but it's become a political necessity, I would say, to mix the lists. So we today have 47% of women in parliament, 4 out of 8 party leaders. We still, and again, we're strongly beaten by the other Nordic countries. They all presently have female prime ministers, and Sweden is lagging behind, but we'll see. Democracy decides these issues. We're doing better when it comes to head of state. We have had 1 or 2 ruling queens during history, but the future is in our hands. The next head of state in Sweden will be a woman. The Crown Princess Victoria will take over when her father steps down. This wasn't a given. When she was born, and when her younger brother was born, the constitution still had it that it was the firstborn son that would take over the crown. But Parliament changed the constitution, and after only 6 months, I think it was, her younger brother lost the right to the throne, and it was the Crown Princess who would take over. So we will have a female head of state, maybe before we have a female prime minister, I don't know. But then let's focus a bit on the feminist foreign policy. Why have we concentrated so much on this? Well, I think it's a natural, it's natural that we follow with the feminist foreign policy from a feminist government. But it's also that, the nations of the world have undertaken in legally binding conventions and legislation and rules to respect, defend and fulfill all people's human rights without any discrimination. So that applies also to women. But we all know that the world isn't that perfect place yet. So that's why we have seen the need for a feminist foreign policy. And the foreign minister who launched it in Sweden, Margot Wallström, she used to say that when she launched it and sort of we were all thought about it and instructed how we would work with it. And she said, well, you have to be patient. There would be several phases, and she would quote Mahatma Gandhi, saying that first, they will ignore you on this issue. Then they will laugh at you. Then they will fight you. But finally, you will win. So I think we are maybe in the third phase. People are starting to take us seriously. Others are joining in the struggle. but we haven't won the battle just yet. So when we look at the feminist foreign policy, we look at what we call the 3 R's, the rights, the representation, and the resources. And that's what we have been sort of obliged, that's how we work. And if we look at the rights, I mean, it is to defend basic human rights and promote all women's and girls' full enjoyment of human rights, which includes combating all forms of violence and discrimination that may restrict their freedom of action. And let me quote just some examples from the World Bank that shows us that we're not there. We today have 104 countries that have laws that prevent women from carrying out certain kinds of jobs, be it in mining, manufacturing, energy, agriculture, or other areas. In 18 countries today, the husband can legally prevent his wife from going to work outside the household. 59 countries have no laws that forbid sexual harassment in the workplace. And 37 countries have no laws to protect a pregnant employee from being dismissed just for being pregnant. And 45 countries have no laws to protect women against violence in the home. 125 countries have legislated against it. But still today, over 600 million women live in countries where it's not punishable to abuse your wife. And I think a very strong point is that over 130 million girls today don't go to school. I mean, we all have the inspiring example of Malala, the Pakistani girl who was shot for going to school. She's now a Nobel laureate and preaching and promoting the girls' right to education all over the world. And she only turned 23 yesterday. So the second R is representation, which means that we shall all promote women's participation and influence in decision-making processes at all levels. And we seek to have a dialogue with women representatives on these issues. We know, again, the world is not ideal. Women are underrepresented on many levels as voters, as politicians, as judges, as leaders in organizations, in industry, and in academia. Excuse me, Professor. But if you look at the statistics. And today, when you look at some statistics, there are only 22 female heads of state or government in the world. And the Interparliamentary Union's global average ranking from June this year, well, they have Rwanda as in first place with actually 61% of women in parliament, and they're followed by Cuba and Bolivia at the top. Sweden is in 7th place with our 47%, and South Africa is in 9th place with 46.6%. But the global average is still only 25%, and it's the same percentage that applies for sub-Saharan Africa. So in an African context, Sweden and South Africa is doing very well. But it just shows how important it is for women to be at the table where issues are discussed and where the discussions are made, where the decisions are made, and where the implementation is also carried out. So Sweden, we have been supporting NGOs working, for instance, on a law in Moldavia that was advocating that at least 40% of parliamentarians needed to be women. And I'm happy to say that law was eventually passed, and Moldavia now has ensured at least 40% female parliamentarians. Sweden also supported a lot of organizations during the parliamentary or before the parliamentary elections in Somalia in 2017, hoping to inspire more women to be candidates and to run. And well, maybe we contributed a little bit to the increase by 70% of the female representation in the Somali parliament. It's still only 24%, but still it was a big step in the right direction. So representation is important. And then we come to an important part, and that's resources. I mean, we know that women own less than 20% of the world's land. And in some countries, they don't even have the legal right to own land. Globally, it's said that 300 million fewer women own a mobile phone compared to men, something that limits their opportunities to access information, and in many countries have access to services like banking and credits and things like that. A UN study was made in 2015 that showed that if the world's labor markets were completely equal, the world's economy would grow by $28 trillion in 10 years. So the world's GDP would rise by 25%. So, I mean, it makes economic sense that we should have equality. So Sweden looks at this very much in our development cooperation to ensure that resources are allocated to promote gender equality and equal opportunities. That's a guiding line in all our development cooperation projects and strategies for countries and regions where we're working. And we increased our support to women's organizations by 35% these last few years. We took a new strategy for gender equality in 2018 that adds another 2 billion South African rands to our work for gender equality. And if I can continue the bragging a little bit, Sweden is the largest single donor to UN Women. So we live a little bit as we preach. Then to these 3 R's, the rights, representation and resources, we have actually added a 4th R, and that's reality. You have to do a reality check, and you have to base all your actions on the actual facts. What is the situation on the ground? What do the statistics say? And that's why I've been quoting maybe a bit much of statistics, but it's important to know what you're talking about. And it's important sometimes also to have statistics disaggregated for gender. I think the health sector is a very good example where in most parts of the world, a lot of research has been made with men as the objects for research, but there's less focus on how treatments, medicines, and others are impacting women. So we need, I think, to balance the perspective in research. So a reality check at all times is very important. So this is the base that we go out from when we work. So how do we spread the word? How do we work with this? Well, I say it's constant and hard day-to-day work. It's something you have to work with all the time and with whatever you do. I mean, from the embassy side here, we have tried to engage in ongoing discussions in the South African society about issues that touch on women's rights and equality. We have tried to network with female groups and organizations that are dealing with gender equality and gender issues. So we have, for instance, for several years been part in the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which is unfortunately also very relevant here in South Africa. And I think a lot of us has been impressed by the president's engagement in the gender-based violence issues and, well, his summit against gender-based violence and the action program that he has then had developed. The embassy has been having, since the lockdown, we started a platform for keeping up the dialogue with our partners and friends called Digitally Yours, where we have had different programs talking about media, the cultural sector, music and everything. But we had one especially dedicated to gender-based violence, where experts from South Africa and from Sweden were talking about especially how the COVID-19 and lockdowns were affecting this issue. We have been working in many countries, including here, on the issue of trafficking, which is sometimes a controversial issue, and I know here as well the issue of prostitution, legalizing, not legalizing. It's a controversial issue, but Sweden has been. We are sort of promoting a policy that makes it illegal to buy a sexual service, but it's not illegal to sell it. This is a legislation that we put into force in 1999, and we think that's the way to go, to take away the market if the buyer is illegal but not the seller. And it's primarily vulnerable girls, a lot of them trafficked, that are sold or selling. But it makes it easier for them to report, to go to the police if they are not illegal in their actions. So that's one issue we've been promoting here. We worked on an issue that we call Wiki Gap. As we all know, Wikipedia is the largest online and user-generated encyclopedia. But it has a great imbalance. 90% of the content has been created by men. And there are about 4 times as many articles about men than about women. So Swedish embassies around the world have been organizing Wiki Gaps, where we have invited female contributors. It can be students, academics, journalists, whatever, that during a day join with us and write articles, editing in articles and writing new ones. And in 3 months, some 4,000 new articles were actually added to Wikipedia that then had a female focus. We are also, together with Denmark, Belgium and Netherlands, we launched the She Decides movement, which was launched in 2017. I think it was to substitute for the funds that President Trump withdrew from the sexual and reproductive health and rights movement with his so-called Mexico City policy. So we've been continuing, and the second meeting of the She Decides movement was actually here in Pretoria in 2017. I think it was in March 2017. So we're in very good company with South Africa on that. And we have generally increased our funding for organizations working with sexual and reproductive health and rights. We also work with She Trades. We have launched, of course, the feminist trade policy as well. And we support the International Trade Center, which is a UN World Trade Organization thing that works with the developing world, maybe. And we have now financed a project that will support female entrepreneurs around the world to connect to the market. And the ambition is to have 1 million female entrepreneurs having connected to the world market, actually by 2020. So we'll see. Part of the feminist foreign policy is, of course, the issue of women, peace, and security. And as you may know, Sweden was a member of the UN Security Council, non-permanent member of the UN Security Council in 2017, 2018. That was the first time in 20 years that we were back at the Security Council, and we were very happy. We were exceptionally happy because I think we got the vote from every country in Africa. We really got the African vote, which we were very proud of. But we then made the issue of women, peace and security our focus as a Security Council member. And of course, a lot of it is based on Resolution 1325, which deals with the issue of women, peace and security. And we're very happy that during our first year in the Security Council in 2017, 100% of presidency statements coming out of the Security Council made references to women, peace and security. We also struggled a lot, but eventually achieved that 50% of all briefers that came to the UN Security Council during our years that came to brief the Security Council on different issues. It was actually part of our focus to open up the Security Council a little bit, that we would have open briefings on a lot of issues. And 50% of the briefers that came were women. So it was not only men coming to talk about how conflicts were developing or not. And we're very happy that when South Africa then went into the Security Council in 2019, we had a lot of cooperation before, and South Africa is sort of keeping the torch high and have taken over a lot of the issues that we advocated during our time, and especially peace and women, peace and security. We have, for instance, worked a lot. We have, in our strategies, we have 12 focus countries in our action plan for women, peace and security. And we have succeeded, I would say, in increasing female participation in the peace processes in Colombia, in Mali, and in Syria. May not go too well in Syria, but still it's important that women are at the table. We have also been driving within the European Union the issue of women, peace and security, and the EU now has a special representative to look at gender issues and focuses specifically on women, peace and security. So we feel that's a great success in our work. We also publish, I think it's still only Sweden and the United States that annually publishes human rights reports on each country, basically in the world, where we sort of go through developments and where countries are, how they are observing different human rights. And of course, these reports have a very strong focus on women's rights and on gender issues as well. And they're all published on the Foreign Ministry's webpage. Unfortunately, they are in Swedish. We don't have the resources to have them translated to English or other languages. And we also started in Sweden, when we instituted the feminist foreign policy, a female mediators network. We started in Sweden, it then developed, and there's a Nordic network of female mediators. Now there are female networks of mediators in many places. And we have also supported the creation of female networks in Africa. And we have cooperated with DIRCO, who I think does a fabulous job in training female mediators coming from all over Africa. I've met some of them, and I think it's a very interesting and it's a very important road to go down. So we're doing, we think, a lot of things. There still remains very much to be done. But as I said, it's the constant day-to-day hard work. You have to keep at it, and you have to think in this special way on any issue you approach. But I'm very glad to be here today and be able to have a dialogue with all of you about how we can carry this forward. So I'll stop there and let's start the dialogue.
Thank you so very much, Ambassador. That was a really wonderful presentation. I'm so glad you brought up gender-based violence in our own country. As you know, it's been increasing over the lockdown period. And it's so heartening to hear you talk about your government's efforts to eradicate such things globally and the different platforms you're using and the different initiatives you're employing to try and make this happen and to advocate for women's rights. It's so inspiring, and thank you so much for revealing all of that to us. For those of us who didn't know, we're now enlightened. I think what we can do now is, I think we did ask people to post comments on the chat and Q&A bar at the beginning, but at the moment, I haven't seen any questions posted on either one. I don't know, Sven, if I'm missing anything that you might be able to see. So I think that we had already asked people to send questions before this. So I suppose what we can do is address those questions first while people have some time to gather their thoughts and ask you questions now live. So if you'd like to refer to some of those questions that Sven had posted to you, I hope you don't mind if you would read out the question for those of us who weren't able to note it, and then your response. That would be wonderful for the next few minutes. Thank you.
So one of them was, or it's actually two questions, sort of following me as a female. I wouldn't say political leader, because I'm really a bureaucrat. I'm a professional diplomat, but still. The question was, are you respected as a high-level politician, and do you ever face subjection based on your gender? And the second, which goes with it, I think, do you receive scrutiny from the media? And if so, is this scrutiny mainly focused on your political decisions, or has any media stereotypically focused on your gender? Well, I think as the first part, if you're respected as a high-level diplomat instead of politician, yes, I have to say I haven't suffered very much. I have to say I grew up with 4 brothers, 3 of them older than myself. So you really had to get your respect yourself. You couldn't negotiate or try to debate. You had to go and get and earn the respect from them, which has probably toughened me for the battles. But I think generally I haven't sort of felt subjection or any sort of discrimination. Of course, there's always instances where you feel that there's a men's club over there where they feel that they are taking the very important decisions. And you just have to work constantly, I think, to break down those clubs. But you have to be prepared and armed with good arguments and really win the arguments with good arguments. And I think that's the way to earn your respect. And then question it, or put your foot down if someone starts to play sort of a gender discriminatory play with you. I think you earn the most respect by then just saying this is not acceptable, so let's move to the issues at hand. And media scrutiny, well, as the professor said, I used to be the spokesperson and head of communications at the foreign ministry, so dealing with the media was an important thing. I have to say I never really suffered or felt that I was unduly criticized just for being a woman. Maybe sometimes I didn't present the issues in a very convincing way, and then I could be criticized, but very seldom. I mean, there may be the odd article about how I dressed or something, but very seldom. But I was a spokesperson in Sweden, which also, it's really not acceptable to have that kind of criticism. There are 2 other questions that go together a little bit. How can Black feminist thought be understood in the long-standing struggle of race and ethnic inequality against women of color? And the second one is, can feminists successfully topple patriarchy in the third world countries? Well, I think for the first one, Black feminist thought and sort of the struggle of Black women, I think it's really a double whammy in many places. I mean, you have to struggle often against racism. Look at what's happening in the United States at the moment and sometimes. But you also have to struggle against sexism. So it's really a double-edged sword that you have to fight. So, I mean, I think just a Black woman needs to be even stronger than many others. A bit stronger in the arguments, stronger in their convictions. But I think what I see here, that's also such a wonderful sisterhood. I think you get a lot of support, and maybe more so here than you would get naturally sometimes in Sweden or in many sort of Western countries. And there, I think everyone needs to be aware that it's actually 2 fights. It's racism and it's sexism. And therefore the need for sisterly support, but also brotherly support is all the more important. And I think, again, there men have a very important role to play, to just stop some of sort of sexist behavior at its core. If enough men would say to their sort of friends and brothers and sisters, this is not acceptable, I really don't respect you for this, it would do a lot. And can feminism successfully topple patriarchy? Well, I think maybe not feminist foreign policy as such, but women can definitely topple patriarchy. I think we saw what happened in Sudan last year, which I think was very encouraging, where women just decided they had enough and they had their sit-ins and just demanded things without violence or anything. But when half of the population starts demanding their rights and things do start to happen. Then I have another one. How does the feminist and neutral approach to foreign policy making influence Sweden's approach to counterterrorism and counter-violent extremists in Africa? That's a tricky question. First, I just want to make a little correction. Sweden is not a neutral country. We used to have a policy of neutrality, which we abolished. We changed it, you can say, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so we're now a non-aligned country, which means we're not a member of any military cooperation. So Sweden is not a member of NATO, for instance. But we have said very publicly that we will not remain neutral if there's an attack on any of our neighboring states. Then we will not be a neutral state, as we were in the Second World War. But I mean, Sweden is against, I would say, against terrorism in all its shapes and forms, all over the world, in Africa and in the Middle East, wherever it raises its head. And I think, again, if you involve women in the processes, in the talks, you often lower the level of strain and of controversy a bit. You can sometimes create a softer climate to discuss the things. But it's really a tricky question. So I can't say that feminist foreign policy is the solution to terrorism or counterterrorism or violent extremists in Africa. I mean, the problem with part of the extremists in Africa and in the Middle East and in other parts is that they totally disrespect the rights of women. So that's a start where we have to convince a lot on that. And then the last question was, what is Sweden's position on nuclear weapons? Well, it's simply we're very much against nuclear weapons. We surely had our own program for development of nuclear weapons after the Second World War. We ended that early in the 1960s, and we are one of the signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We signed it in 1968. And since then, we have been very sort of vocal supporters of non-proliferation of nuclear arms and of the disarmament of nuclear arms and a lot of other arms at the same. So I could say we're a very vocal supporter of a non-nuclear world eventually. So I think I stopped there. Those were the questions I got.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you very much. There are two questions that have popped in now while you were talking. And one of them, I think, pertains to when you were discussing Sweden's efforts to bolster female access to entrepreneurship and all that you're doing to try and make sure women can enter the marketplace and have opportunities to enter the marketplace. And we have one person who would like to know if training and funds might already be available for potential candidates in these types of programs. And I imagine that's where they've stopped, but I imagine they may want to know if they could access those somehow or get to know more about those somehow through the embassy. I don't know.
Well, when it comes to sort of female ownership and sort of female entrepreneurs entering the market, it is, as I said, the International Trade Center in Geneva that we are funding to drive this project to help female entrepreneurs connect with the market. So my advice would actually be then to contact them and see what the opportunities are. I have to admit that I'm not quite aware of all the details in the program. But it's also, I mean, when we talk about female ownership or female sort of economic representation, that's something we work hard on in our development cooperation, for instance. We support a lot of projects that specifically aimed at strengthening female ownership and female, I mean, the women's possibilities to start their business, to own their business, to finance their business around in the world. And again, also our human rights reports focuses very much and tries to name and shame where there is legislation that doesn't permit a woman to sort of be active in the market. Training and funds. I am a bit sad to say that, I mean, Sweden doesn't have a bilateral cooperation with South Africa anymore. You became too rich when you became a middle-income country, high middle-income. So we're focusing our bilateral development cooperation with the poorer countries. But we work with some organizations here in South Africa that also work regionally. So I would advise, just send an email to the embassy and we can try to help direct people who would like to get in touch with some of them. There's not a lot of possibilities, but we'll do our best to support.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador. We have another question. This relates to, I think, a lot of our female students who are excellent scholars, but are facing a lot of barriers in our own society in South Africa when it comes to entering the workplace politically, and entering the workplace. Because we have one student here who says she's referring to the fact that women voters in South Africa are over 50% of the population. So it's quite a large voting base of females, but we're still only 46% represented in Parliament. So there's an imbalance there already. But how would you advise young women who are just emerging, I suppose, from their early academic careers to aspire to be within politics, given the barriers they may face? I don't know if you want to reflect on your own personal experience, how you managed to move up the ladder of sorts in professional diplomacy.
I have to say, I haven't really entered myself, but I've talked a lot to sort of young women, and we have been sort of, from the embassy side, tried to connect especially with sort of young people in South Africa, and especially young women. And I've always been keen to sort of ask, what are your plans for engagement? And unfortunately, a lot of them, I mean, very bright academics, bright young girls that are finishing their studies. And you ask them, I mean, that was a natural question before the elections here. Are you going to be engaged? And I think still there's a lot of tradition here. A lot of them, unfortunately, were a bit hesitant. If you said, well, why don't you sort of engaged we had a meeting one evening in the residence with representatives from the youth leagues of the three main parties. And it was fascinating. And the discussions that they had in between themselves. But too many of the girls said, well, it's almost impossible to sort of run for a high post in the youth leagues. I mean, I thought some of them would be excellent leaders of the ANC Youth League or the DA Youth League or the EFF Youth League, but it's still very traditional. So I think, again, girls and young women here have to go together and support each other. And as you say, they're more than half of the voters. So they do have an impact, but they have to start voting for one another as well and promote one another. I think that's the best advice I can give.
Thank you so much. I hope, Katerina, you were listening to that you sent in that question and you take heart from that. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A and chat. So I think that I'll give a few more minutes on that and just offer a comment quickly from my side. And that is that I was so interested to hear that when you took your time in Sweden on the platform and the Security Council as a non-permanent member, and you used that time over those 2 years to ensure that those people briefing the Security Council on issues were at least 50% women, was such an interesting thing for me to hear. And also, again, very enlightening. And it's such an important thing because South Africa, as you know, is serving its 3rd term now, very recent space of time as well. And we're always very dedicated to very specific things and focus very much on promoting the African continent, for example. And it's lovely to hear a Western country, a very developed Western country, focusing on promoting women's rights, but not just focusing on it in terms of what you say, but the actions you take, ensuring that there are females present there, voicing their own views about conflict situations. It's so important. It's walking the talk. And it's what makes Sweden fall into a category of theory in the literature that we refer to as good international citizens. Because it's,
I'm glad.
It's saying what you're doing what you're saying. And often South Africa has been persecuted for not doing that. And I think sometimes very unfairly. Because we're actually pretty consistent with what we say and what we do in a lot of ways. So I was very happy to hear you say that about Sweden. And again, very happy to hear that Sweden has used its platform when it had the chance to make a difference in the world in relation to these very pertinent issues. And the more people who speak about it, the more opportunities we have like this, where you've managed to share your experience and your government's views with so many of us here today, the better it is. And it can only improve the world as a result. I think, okay, sorry, I thought another question popped in, but Katerina just wants to thank you for your advice that you gave her about entering politics. So thank you so much, Ambassador. I think what I'll do now is I'm not going to belabor this. If people are satisfied and have no more questions, I'm going to let you get on with your day. I'm sure it's very busy despite lockdown. There's something to do. But just to say thank you so much, again, for sharing your government's views, your personal views, and in your eloquent way. And to say thank you, it's such an important thing that you are here today. And you're an inspiring woman, and now you're adding to all the other women in the world who are inspiring people to talk about these kinds of things and make a difference. So on behalf of you, Jay, and the Department of Politics, and Sven, who helped set up this whole event today, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I can end by showing this. We have a handbook, actually, in feminist foreign policy. And we have posted now on our webpage, Sweden Abroad/Pretoria, on our Facebook page. And I think we will tweet out the link. You can download it or read it just electronically. But it's a good handbook for everyone who wants to sort of work on the issues, including how to enter politics and how to make your case. So
thank you.
Please. And thanks everyone for listening and for giving us Sweden the platform to talk about our favorite subject.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.